Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Welcome. Hotel. Give me just a second to make sure I got everything running smooth. Make sure the sound is right. Make sure everybody can see and hear. We got a good one for y'all today, as always. We're gonna be dealing with some history, some known history to some little known history to others. And we're gonna be continuing with this theme of allowing the ancestors to speak. Okay. Yeah, we good. We good. We in the building. Y'all come in here, man. Y'all come in here. Do me a favor. When you click on the video and when you get in the building, make sure you hit that like button. And if you haven't already subscribed, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Show a little support by hitting that like button and make sure that you subscribe to the channel. I got a lot of good information I'm going to share with y'all today. I hope y'all like it and I hope y'all appreciate it. And again, we're continuing on with the theme that I've been working on for a few days now. We're going to be continuing with the theme, let the ancestors speak. So let's get this slideshow going so we can get into the information. So y'all won't have to wait too long. Okay, y'all see the title. Today, we're going to be talking about presidential slave owners and the dark history of the United States, part 1. That's presidential slave owners, the dark history of the United States, part 1. And I say part 1 because it's honestly too many presidential slave owners to deal with in one video. So I'm going to break this one down into multiple parts. But today we're going to be dealing with the first and third presidents of the United States. We're going to be talking about George Washington, who we all know is the first president of the United States. And we're going to be talking about Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States. Now, the second president of the United States was a man named John Adams, but he was one of the few who never owned any slaves. So let's get right off into it, dealing with George Washington. Some of these things you may know, some of these things you may not know. So George Washington, he was president of the United States from April 30th, 1789 to March 4th, 1797. He was born February the 22nd, 1732, and he passed away December the 14th, 1799. Now, before we get into it, I just want to say that there is a lot of good press about George Washington, him being a fighter in the American Army, him fighting in the American Revolution, him holding several seats of prominence in American history. His face is on our money. And just his name alone, George Washington, you would be hard pressed to find anyone in America who does not know his name. And there are thousands upon thousands of positive tales that are told about George Washington, but there are some things about the man that are a little less known. One of them being that George Washington himself was a slave owner. That's correct. The man who they tell the story about after cutting down his father's cherry tree bravely, and this is a myth, mind you, bravely told his father, "I cannot tell a lie. I cut down your cherry tree." That man, George Washington, the first president of the United States, was a slave owner, and he didn't own one or two slaves. He didn't own 3 or 4 slaves. We're going to get into exactly how many slaves he owned, where his plantation was, and how those enslaved individuals were treated. Now, George Washington, he was an American founding father, a military officer, a politician, and statesman who served as the first president of the United States from 1789 to 1797. He was appointed by the Second Continental Congress as commander of the Continental Army in June of 1775. Washington led Patriot forces to victory in the American Revolutionary War and then served as president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. which drafted and ratified the Constitution of the United States and established the American federal government. Washington has thus been called the father of the nation, the father of the United States of America. Now, those are a lot of positive accolades, and I can take nothing away from the positive things that are attributed to his name, but some little known facts. He was a slave owner. Now, you see this picture that we're looking at right here? This is a little less known picture of the first president, George Washington. This one that I'm showing on this slide, everyone is familiar with this. In fact, this almost looks like the depiction of Washington that we see on our money. But this one is a slightly less known George Washington, right? A slightly less known picture of George Washington that seeks to depict him during the American Revolutionary War. So we have George Washington on the left, and we have a curious figure standing behind him on the right. We see an African American man with a turban style head wrap, wearing black clothes, wearing a black jacket with red collar, and he appears to be holding something. Now, what this gentleman is actually holding is supposed to be George Washington's horse. He was with George Washington during the American Revolutionary War. And the caption that will always go along with this photo tells you that this is a portrait of George Washington and his manservant, an enslaved man named William Lee. Now, they're calling him a manservant because when you're talking about the institution of slavery, an individual that was enslaved had to do anything that his owner or his quote unquote master told him to do. But there were a multiplicity of specified jobs that these individuals had. You had some of the enslaved, they were blacksmiths. You had some of the enslaved, they were cooks and chefs. You had some of the enslaved, they worked inside of the fields. And you had some of the enslaved, they were what were called manservants or woman servants. They tended to the needs of the specific owner. This guy would have been responsible for shaving George Washington, combing his hair, helping him to get dressed, putting his shoes on and off, putting his socks on and off. When he got into a room and he was about to take off his coat, this guy would help him take off his coat and go find a place to hang it up. As the picture depicts, during the Revolutionary War, when George Washington wasn't actually sitting on his horse, he was holding the reins. And even during the war, when George Washington would be riding on his horse, this guy would be walking, jogging, or running alongside the president to tend to any needs he may have while on the battlefield and off the battlefield. Check this out. On April 16th, 1789, George Washington left his home at Mount Vernon to travel to New York to be inaugurated as the first president of the United States. He was accompanied by Charles Thompson, the Secretary of Congress, and Colonel David Humphreys, Washington's longtime friend and secretary. Although the president-elect made no mention of their presence in his diary, he was also accompanied by several enslaved individuals. Yes, when the first president, George Washington, was elected to be the president of the United States, and he traveled to Washington to carry out the duties of his office, he brought along with him several of his slaves to tend to him and to tend to his wife and to tend to the White House while he was there. Now, why am I saying that he brought these enslaved people with him? Well, he did not acquire slaves once he became the president. He actually came from a slave-holding family. George Washington's father owned slaves, and when he passed away, those slaves became the possession of George Washington. So George Washington actually, before he became a president, he lived on, was raised on, and operated a slave plantation in Virginia known as Mount Vernon. If you ever heard of Mount Vernon, where George Washington lived, that is a slave plantation. Okay, which it shouldn't be hard to wrap your mind around, because the picture I'm showing you right now and what I just described to you, this individual, William Lee, the enslaved man, was with George Washington at the Revolutionary War. George Washington was not the president during the Revolutionary War. So George Washington was a slave owner before he even became president of the United States. Follow me. Now, this is an aerial photo of the Mount Vernon plantation. This is where George Washington was born. This is where he was raised. This is the property that he inherited from his slave owning father. And this is where William Lee, the man from the previous picture, was enslaved to George Washington at. And when George Washington left this Mount Vernon plantation to go to Washington to carry out his duties as the president, he took several slaves from this plantation with him. Now, Mount Vernon is the former plantation of the founding father, commander of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, and the first president of the United States, George Washington, and his wife, Martha. The Washington family acquired land in the area in 1674. Around 1734, the family embarked on an expansion of its estate that continued under George Washington, who began leasing the estate in 1754 before becoming its sole owner in 1761. And this is another shot of the Mount Vernon plantation for some of you who have never seen it but have actually heard the name. Okay. Yes, a slave plantation, just like you hear about in any of the other stories. This is where George Washington came from. Now, as you would imagine, on a slave plantation, you have something that would be known as the slave quarters. Where did the individuals that were enslaved live? They called those slave quarters. Now, this isn't a original slave quarters cabin on Mount Vernon, but this is a recreation of what an actual slave quarters looked like at the Mount Vernon plantation. Now, the standard form of housing for enslaved people on George Washington's 4 outlying forms was described by one 18th century visitor as log houses. These cabins were daubed with mud to keep out droughts and rain, and often had exterior wooden chimneys that were fashioned of sticks plastered with mud. There appear to have been 2 sizes of cabins used as slave quarters. Small ones made up of 1 room, and a larger duplex type for 2 families consisting of 2 rooms, each with a separate entrance divided by a chimney in the middle. Now, this is what the average slave quarters on Mount Vernon looked like, the inside of the house. You can see off to the right side of the photograph, you can see where the fireplace would have been. That's where they would have tried to make some type of fire to keep themselves warm during the cold months, or where they would have tried to cook their meals and prepare their meals. And you see that their beds were created and built in a bed bunk style fashion. What's interesting about this, if anybody is watching this video, have ever been to prison, you're going to notice something. How these beds are set up and how a lot of these slave quarters were set up look a lot like a prison dorm room. This is how those bunks are set up in the particular dorms. And it's even wild because you would have your personal belongings, your shirts and pants and socks and shoes, and maybe a bowl to eat out of and a spoon and your particular commissary food. You would have that maybe like stashed underneath your bunk or something like that, or underneath your mattress. And even the entire setup looks very reminiscent to what prisons look like today. Most living quarters were poorly constructed and leaky, described by one observer visiting Mount Vernon in 1797 as being wretched. The visitor explained, "We entered one of the huts of the blacks. The husband and wife sleep on a mean pallet, the children on the ground, a very bad fireplace, some utensils for cooking, but in the middle of this poverty, some cups and a teapot." And so someone actually visited one of the slave cabins at Mount Vernon, and he explained that the adults would sleep on a pallet and the children would often have to sleep on the ground. And this is another photograph depicting what the slave quarters on Mount Vernon would have looked like. The slave plantation run by George Washington and his family. Now, one may ask themselves, okay, we know George Washington was a slave owner, right? We understand that Mount Vernon was the plantation, but what do we know about some of the individuals that he enslaved? Do we know any of their names? Do we know any of their ages? Do we know any of their roles? And in fact, we do. There isn't how can I say this? There isn't massive amounts of information on the specifics of the enslaved, the people that were enslaved to George Washington, but we do have some information. Now, a few of the names of the individuals made their names live on forever and made their memory never die. Of the individuals that was enslaved to President George Washington, there was an individual named Ona, who was age 16 in 1789. We have one named Hercules, who was age 35. Maul, who was age 50. Gills, who was age 32. Austin, who was age 30. Richmond, who was age 11. Paris, who was a teenager. Joe Richardson, who was in the early 20s. Christopher Shields, who was 15. And William Lee, who was 39. And William Lee, mind you, was the individual from the beginning who was with George Washington during the Revolutionary War. Now, this isn't a complete list of the names of individuals that was enslaved by George Washington. Actually, and we're going to go into this later, when George Washington died, there were around 317 people enslaved at Mount Vernon. About 123 of those were directly owned by the ex-president. So George Washington owned at least 123 slaves. So make no mistake about it, this small list isn't a complete list of the names of people that were enslaved by George Washington. Now, what you're looking at on the left side of the screen, this is an advertisement for the return of Ona Judge. You see, Ona name is on the list on the right, and she was aged around 16 in 1789. Now, one might assume that if an individual was enslaved to somebody as prominent as George Washington, who was the president of the United States, then quite possibly their enslavement was not as bad as the individuals that was enslaved to other people in the South. But although we don't have specific records of exactly how their treatment and their punishments were carried out, we do know that George Washington was a typical slave owner. So we do know that punishments were meted out, overseers were used, and possible beatings and people being killed happened. You know, we have, for all intents and purposes, we can assume that happened. But a glimpse that we get into the idea that just because you were a slave to George Washington, everything was hunky dory and you enjoyed being a slave to George Washington. We have an advertisement for one of the enslaved who actually tried to escape, right? And the individual would obviously only try to escape if they are unsatisfied with their living conditions. Okay, so let's take a look at this advertisement from this was posted in the newspaper May 24th, 1796. Okay, May 24th, 1796. And let's take a look. So it says advertisement: absconded from the household of the President of the United States, Ona Judge, a light mulatto girl, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy black hair. She is of middle stature, slender, and delicately formed, about 20 years of age. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that they're saying that this Ona Judge is a mulatto girl. Now, what a mulatto is a mixed individual. If one of your parents were black and one of your parents were white, you are a mulatto. If one of your parents are black and one of your parents were Native American, you are a mulatto. But the term was overwhelmingly used for individuals that had a white parent and a black parent. And we can reasonably assume that the father was white and the mother was black, because even if the father was white and the mother was black, and a black mother gave birth to a mulatto child, that mulatto child would still be born enslaved because the mother was enslaved. So the fact that we know that she was a light-skinned mulatto girl, we can reasonably assume that this woman who was enslaved to George Washington had a white father. The advertisement goes on to say she had many changes of good clothes of all sorts, but they are not sufficiently uh, recollected to be something bad, as there was no suspicion of her going off nor no provocation to do so. It is not easy to conjecture whither she has gone or fully what her design is, but as she may attempt to escape by water, all matters of vessels are cautioned against admitting her into them, although it is probable she will attempt to pass for a free woman and has, it is said, wherewithal to pay her passage. So they're trying to say that they have no clue why she would be trying to escape in the first place. They're saying that she may try to escape by water, so they're alerting all of the vessels to be on the lookout for her. And they saying that she may try to pass herself off as a free woman. Now, the only way she could do that is basically if she have a little money in her pocket and she has some type of an education. Some of these individuals that were enslaved to President George Washington, they could read and write, unlike the majority of individuals that was enslaved. And so she possibly had some form of education that she could use to make herself seem as if she was free. So they were afraid of her trying to play that role. They go on to say $10 will be paid to any person who will bring her home if taken in the city or on board any vessel in the harbor, and a reasonable additional sum if apprehended at and brought from a greater distance, and in proportion to the distance. Basically saying if she's taken, close to home, or if she's taken in the city or on board a vessel in the harbor of the city, then she'll be paid $10. But if she's farther away and they catch her farther away and they have to transport her all the way back, they will be paid extra additional money on top of the $10 relative to where they had to bring her from. Now, an interesting thing about this is they never found her. Right? They never found this on the judge. When she escaped for good. And the historical record doesn't really tell us what happened to her after this. We wish her safe travels, or in that time period, but we just take our hats off to her, and we could just hope that wherever she went, wherever she ended up, she was able to live out her life how she wanted, how she desired, without being subjected to the rule of anyone else ever again. And Ona Judge was not the only person who actually had to make an escape from George Washington. She isn't the only runaway that ever escaped and was never found again. And there were some people who escaped from George Washington. They were actually caught and they were brought back. Right? They were caught and they were brought back, no doubt about it. But let's move on. Now, when one may ask themselves, what possibly, because we're theorizing here, what possibly could have led to one of George Washington's slaves running away? And not just one, but multiple. We have to look into what could the possible treatment of these enslaved individuals have been. Now, on the screen, what you're looking at here this is actually George Washington's teeth. Now, they're not George Washington's real teeth, because for the majority of his adult life, or basically the entirety of his adult life, he had really bad teeth, really bad gums, and his teeth were constantly falling out. So what you're looking at is actually a set of dentures that George Washington had made and that he used in his mouth. Now, I'm not sure if some of you have heard the myth. I know I heard this myth when I was growing up, and they used to say that George Washington's dentures were made out of wood. I even recall seeing some cartoons where they played on this myth and gave George Washington wooden teeth. And I didn't think about it back then. And I really didn't think about it until I learned the truth. But you have to ask yourself, why would someone make up a myth that George Washington had wooden teeth? You would think in your mind that, oh, it was so long ago, they did not have the medical know-how to make an individual proper dentures. So the only thing that they could do with limited medical science is give an individual wood teeth. But the truth of the matter is a little more darker than that. There's a darker side to why they wanted to say George Washington had wooden teeth, and that was to hide the truth. Listen to this. Contrary to the popular myth that George Washington wore wooden false teeth, the dentures he used, shown here, are made from animal and human teeth. He bought teeth from his slaves as well as elephant and walrus ivory. The false teeth were embedded in a base of lead and made flexible with steel springs. Deep within one of Washington's account books is an entry which details Washington's purchase of 9 teeth from Negroes for 122 shillings. Now, I want you to think about that. In his mouth, he had the teeth of some of his slaves. Now, an individual may try to say, well, the account says that, he paid for him. He bought this individual's teeth. Yes, that may be true. They actually did put some of that type of record in there, but that record could have actually been falsified. Think about it. If you are a slave owner, then you own the body, mind, and soul of this individual that you have enslaved. You have the right to do with them as you please. Technically, they cannot refuse you. They cannot tell you no. And even with this person's own body, what a slave owner would often do to make money is rent the slave out. So if a third party had a job that needed to be done, they would go to said slave owner, like George Washington, and they would say, hey, I need somebody for the next 6 months to work on said project for me. How much would I have to pay you to rent one of your slaves to come and do this work on my property? George Washington would give them a quote of how much money it would take to how much money he wanted to give them this enslaved person for 6 months. They would pay George Washington directly, and that individual would go and do the work. So why would someone who owns another human being and rents this individual out, gets paid for that individual's work, why would they themselves pay the slave for his teeth, knowing the slave cannot say no? I think what makes more sense is that George Washington just took the teeth of one or more of his slaves and put those teeth inside of his mouth. And it was recorded as if he purchased the teeth just to hide the fact that he simply just took the teeth. Because what you're going to see as we move forward, George Washington, along with a lot of these other guys, on the surface, they tried to pretend like they were anti-slavery. Even George Washington himself, while owning slaves, he tried to make statements and posture as if he were anti-slavery, but at the same time, he was owning slaves. Owning slaves and being anti-slavery does not work together. But we know for a fact that President George Washington, the first president of the United States, had slave teeth, the teeth of some of his slaves, in his mouth. Now, again, the record says that he paid for these teeth, but I don't believe it. I don't believe it not 1 minute. I think he just took the teeth. But at any rate, he put those teeth inside of his mouth. Now, check this out. At the time of George Washington's death, the Mount Vernon estate's enslaved population consisted of 317 people. Now, the Mount Vernon plantation is President George Washington's own plantation. So by the time he died, there were 317 people enslaved on this plantation. The same man who, quote unquote, fought in the Revolutionary War. He had enough sense, right, to fight in a war to become independent from the rule of the King of Great Britain, King George III, but at the same time, while being willing to fight and die for his own freedoms, understanding the concept of freedom, was willing to enslave and continue the enslavement of another group of people, even up until his death. Now, these 317 people, all of these 317 people were not owned outright by George Washington. George Washington only owned 123 of these enslaved people. If you look at the picture on the left of your screen, it gives you a breakdown of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon. So the total population of enslaved was 317. Now, those owned by George Washington was only 123. Those owned by the Custis estate was 154. Those rented from local landowners was 41 people. Now, remember, when I was talking about the teeth thing, what people would do is they would rent out their slaves. So in addition to the slaves that they owned on the plantation that George Washington owned, and the slaves on the plantation that was owned by the Custis estate, obviously there was more work needed to be done on such a large plantation than those amount of slaves could take care of. But however, or so they had to rent out other slaves from other local landowners and slave owners. So in addition to the slaves that George Washington owned, the Custis estate owned, they also went out and purchased for rent 41 other enslaved individuals. And you see how it says freed by Washington's 1799 will, 123 people. He, quote unquote, with his will, he decided that those people that were enslaved by him would be freed upon his death. But that was really just legal mumbo jumbo. They weren't actually freed in his will. They were bequeathed to his wife in his will. And his wife was supposed to free them when she died. But you may be wondering, what is the Custis estate, and why would the Custis estate have slaves on Mount Vernon property? So check this out, family. The Custis family in America can trace its roots to the late 17th century, when the family split into three distinct branches. Some members remained in Ireland, while others immigrated to Belgium and others to the Virginia colony. The Custis family has become somewhat less well known over time, but it includes one very famous member, Martha Dandridge Custer Washington. 2 years prior to her marriage to George Washington in 1759, Martha Washington was married to a wealthy Virginian named Daniel Parke Custis, whose death left her a young widow. The Custis family became intertwined with the Washington family as George Washington adopted and raised two generations of Custis children. Martha Washington's ties to the Custis estate brought George Washington wealth, property, and influence upon the couple's marriage. So when they're talking about the Custis estate, his wife, Martha, was intimately tied to the Custis estate because she was married to a Custis before she was married to George Washington. And that family, the Custis family, was another well-to-do slave-owning family. And so all of the slaves on the Mount Vernon plantation didn't outright own to George Washington himself. They somewhat were owned by Martha Washington, his wife, but she didn't have direct ownership of them. Meaning, when she died, she could not do with them what she wanted. They would technically go back to the Custis estate. And so when Martha Washington died, those other slaves that were owned by the Custis estate went to some of her descendants who were in that Custis bloodline, because her and George Washington, they never had children. They never had children of their own. So not only was George Washington descended from a family of slave owners and was a slave owner himself, his wife, prior to being married to him, was married into a family of slave owners. And when these two slave owning families came together, they increased their wealth, they increased their prestige, they increased their bank account, they increased the amount of land that they owned, and they increased the amount of slaves that they owned as well. And this right here, this is a portrait of George Washington, Martha Washington, and two children. Now, these two children are not George Washington's children. And you see behind Martha is another African American individual mixed into the painting. So this is another enslaved individual who was enslaved at the Mount Vernon plantation. Check this out. George and Martha had no children of their own, but their family life was dominated by the Custis children. Washington served as a father figure for his two stepchildren, John Jackie Park Custis and Martha Patchy Park Custis. Patchy was an epileptic and passed away following a seizure when she was only 17 years old in 1773. Washington noted her death in his diary in a simple statement. About 5 o'clock, poor Patsy Custis died suddenly. So while George Washington never had any biological children of his own with his wife Martha had children from her previous marriage, and George Washington raised these children as if they were his direct biological children. And so when George Washington died, he left the slaves that he owned outright to Martha, and the other slaves that were enslaved to the Custis estate that Martha Stewart was a custodian of while she was alive, those slaves went down to the children and grandchildren of the Custis bloodline. And those individuals, they pretty much stayed enslaved. They stayed enslaved, right? Now look, check this out. Now I'm going to go somewhere in just a few minutes, so don't be confused when I'm telling you about George Washington giving his slaves freedom in his will. I'm going to show you that he never really wanted to free his slaves. He wanted to keep his slaves because he did. An individual saying that they're going to free their slaves when they're dead, yeah, you have no more use for them. So to free them when they're dead, that's nothing. But to free them when you're alive and to actually do without them and to stop using them for their free labor, that would mean a whole lot more. But as the record states, they try to say that George Washington made his most public anti-slavery statement after his death. Remember, he made comments while he was alive pretending to be anti-slavery, but the reality is he owned slaves until his death. And he didn't immediately free them when he died. He passed them on to his wife. Anyway, in his will, Washington ordered that his enslaved workers be freed at his wife's death. Unfortunately, this applied to fewer than half of the people in bondage at Mount Vernon. Those owned by the Custis estate were inherited by Martha Washington's grandchildren after her death. Many Washington and Custis enslaved people had married and formed families together. For them, separation from loved ones tainted celebrations of newfound freedom. So even though he decided to free the people that were directly enslaved to him after his wife Martha died, those individuals still had family members, husbands, wives, children that were enslaved to the Custis estate, and their family members did not get any type of freedom. So I I appreciate the decision to free the ones that he did, but I by no means take that to say that George Washington was an abolitionist or that George Washington was against slavery or anything like that. Anything like that. Watch this. I'm gonna show you guys something. I'm gonna show you guys how, in all actuality, George Washington and his wife, they played games with the idea that they wanted to um, manumit or free their slaves. Right? They didn't want to do that at all. And I like, again, doing it after you die means nothing. It means nothing at all. Check this out. This is the website whitehousehistory.org. I'm going to show you guys something that exposes the whole idea that George Washington or his wife really cared about freeing the slaves that they owned. Just a second. Let me find. It's a lot of good information in here as well. You may want to look this up, read through the entire article. It would probably take too long for me to read through the article on this video. Look, all right, right here. We're on this line right here. It says, on April 5th, Attorney General Edmund Randolph called on Martha Washington while the president was out of town. Randolph warned the Washingtons that Pennsylvania's 1780 gradual abolition law freed enslaved people after they lived in the state for 6 consecutive months. The Washingtons and Lear conspired to rotate many of the enslaved people back to Mount Vernon to reset their residence. As Shields was literate and able to write, Washington may have worried that he would learn about the law and seek his freedom. In September 1791, Washington sent Shields back to Mount Vernon permanently. So let's start right there. Shields is an enslaved individual on the Mount Vernon plantation, and he was taken to Washington with George Washington. So what happened was, in 1780, they passed something that was known as the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. This was a way in which people who were against the institution of slavery sought to end slavery without doing it all at once. They tried to create laws that would slowly free the enslaved people and make it difficult and impossible to enslave others in the future, so that they could, and not in one generation, but they could possibly in several generations go from being a nation who had slaves to a nation who did not have slaves. This was pushed by the abolitionists. Look, it says the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, the first extensive abolition legislation in the Western Hemisphere, passed the Pennsylvania General Assembly on March 1st, 1780. To appease slave owners, the act gradually emancipated enslaved people without making slavery immediately illegal. The act permitted Pennsylvania slaveholders to keep the enslaved individuals they already owned unless they failed to register them annually. At the same time, the act provided for the eventual freedom of individuals who were newly born into slavery. Now, one of the things that was in this Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, it stated that if an enslaved person was in the state of Pennsylvania for 6 consecutive months, then they would gain their freedom. Now, this was enacted so that, let's say, individuals that escape. You hear a lot about individuals in the South trying to escape their freedom. If an individual that was enslaved on a southern plantation, or any plantation, mind you, after this act was passed, if they were able to escape and make it to Pennsylvania, and if they were able to live in Pennsylvania consistently for 6 months straight, after those 6 months, they would be deemed free and able to enjoy the freedoms of any free, quote unquote, Negro, or any black free person in America. It was a means by which they tried to legally get individuals free. And when you hear about individuals on the Underground Railroad with Harriet Tubman and multiple conductors that were fleeing from southern states, yes, when they stated they were fleeing to the north, they were trying to flee to free states. The main free state that they were fleeing to on the Underground Railroad was Pennsylvania for situations like this. You have an individual in history named William Steele. He's known as the father of the Underground Railroad. He was in Pennsylvania. He was a free man, a free African American in Pennsylvania, and he worked hand in hand with something that was known as the Vigilance Committee. And so what they would do, they would work hand in hand with quote unquote conductors of the Underground Railroad. People like Harriet Tubman, who would actually try to lead the enslaved to freedom, to the free states, and give them assistance along the way. They would try to bring them to William Steele, and then William Steele would try to get them clothes, try to get them money, try to, if they had family that was already free, try to get them in touch with their family. Or if the slave hunters were on their heels, try to keep them safe and keep them hidden until they actually acquired their freedom legally. Or a lot of times they would find ways to ship them to Canada. A lot of escaped slaves went directly to Canada. And there's a wonderful book that I own. It's called The Underground Railroad Records, where the father of the Underground Railroad, William Steele, he kept a lot of records of the names of the individuals that came to Pennsylvania and came to him. He kept their names, he kept their stories, he kept detailed records. And so if you read through that book, you can get a lot of information on our ancestors, what they went through, in slavery, what they went through to actually escape. And so Pennsylvania was one of those beacons of hope, going back all the way, as you see, to the 1780. So now, mind you, this is what they were referring to. This is what they were referring to in the PowerPoint that I was just telling you about with Martha Stewart and George Washington. Someone came and warned the Washingtons about this Pennsylvania Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, saying that, hey, you better watch out because this could be a means by which your slaves can get free if you're not careful. Now, I'm going to show you guys something, because what I'm disputing is the idea that George Washington or Martha Washington actually wanted to free their slaves. This is why they really don't get too many points freeing them in their will. They get some points for freeing them in their will. I can't take everything from them, but I understand that in life, they didn't want to do it. They just knew that after they died, they don't care anymore. They specifically have no more need for the enslaved. Right now, check this out. Right here, check this out, family. Ironically, the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 later jeopardized Washington's status as a slave owner. Wait, hold on. Now, wait, let me say this first. Because, see, this is the game that they want to play. This is the game that George Washington wanted to play. In September 1786, George Washington expressed his support of gradual abolition in a letter to John Francis Mercer. Mercer served as a delegate from Virginia in Congress and as a lieutenant in the 3rd Virginia Regiment during the American Revolutionary War. In the letter, Washington disclosed his intentions to never purchase another slave person unless it was necessary in certain situations. So wait a minute. You promise to never purchase another enslaved person unless it's necessary in certain situations, unless you want to. Washington further expressed his hope for Virginia to see some plan adopted by the legislature by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. So Washington declares that, he's all for the gradual abolition. He's all for freeing the slaves. He want to see slaves get their freedom. All the while he's owning slaves. Right? It's called lip service. If an individual slave owner really wanted to see slaves get free, they would do what, family? they would free their slaves. It doesn't do you any good to say that you think all slaves should be free, and then you turn around and, hey, nigga, go get me a cup of tea. You understand? In the very next breath, you talking to the slaves that you own. But look, check this out in the next paragraph. Ironically, the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 that George Washington is pretending to support later jeopardized Washington's status as a slave owner. During Washington's residence in Philadelphia, while serving as President of the United States, he instructed his secretary Tobias Lear to seek an analysis of the Act's emancipation provisions from Attorney General Edmund Randolph, the one that warned Margaret Washington. Based on Randolph's findings, Lear advised Washington to rotate enslaved workers he had brought from Mount Vernon out of Pennsylvania every 6 months to prevent their legal emancipation. Washington instructed Lear to keep this matter to himself. I request that these sentiments and this advice may be known to none but yourself and Miss Washington. He had the enslaved people from Mount Vernon transported across state lines every 6 months to prevent their legal emancipation. These enslaved people included Washington's cook, Hercules, who eventually tried to escape, his valet, Christopher Shields, the individual that they said was intelligent and they had to ship him off because he could read and they didn't want him to find out about the law. Martha Washington's lady maid, Ona Judge, the individual that I showed you the article of, who eventually did escape off to freedom and never was caught again, and other enslaved house workers, including Maul, Austin, Gills, and Richmond. So what they're telling you is, in Pennsylvania, with this Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, one of the provisions was that if an individual slave had residence in Philadelphia for 6 consecutive months, they could be granted their legal freedom, or you would have to grant them their legal freedom. So what George Washington did, while on the surface acting like he supported the gradual abolition of slavery, the gradual freedom of all the slaves, what he did, instead of saying, you know what, since I support this so much, after 6 months, all of the slaves that I have here with me, I'm going to let them go. No, he did not do that. Because what he did was he brought from Mount Vernon several slaves. He brought them to Washington. He brought them to Philadelphia with him when he was residing in Philadelphia while he was the president. And so instead of releasing them or freeing them after 6 months, when the 6-month time frame came up, he took them and he transported them back to Mount Vernon. Then from Mount Vernon, he transported them back to Pennsylvania. So the 6-month clock would have to start over again. You understand what I'm telling you? So what he would do every 6 months, he would send them back to Mount Vernon for a second. And then from Mount Vernon, he would bring them back to Philadelphia so that they would never become free. And then he said that he requests that nobody knows about this except him and his wife, Miss Washington. He didn't want anybody to know that he was playing games with the people. And that's why I say I don't really respect the fact that George Washington tried to make it seem like in certain speeches that he was against slavery. And that's why, although I do give him credit for putting in his will that the individuals that he had enslaved would go free after the death of his wife, I can't give him full credit as being an abolitionist because he had ample opportunity to free them in their lifetime, and he could have did it legally. He was in a perfect position to do it legally. However, he wanted to be waited on hand and foot, so he never did do it. So let's move on to Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson is the 3rd president of the United States of America, and he was president from March 4th, 1801 to March 4th, 1809. Now, Thomas Jefferson was an American statesman, diplomat, lawyer, architect, philosopher, and founding father who served as the president of the United States from 1801 to 1809. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence following the American Revolutionary War, and prior to becoming president in 1801, Jefferson was the nation's first U.S. Secretary of State under George Washington and then the nation's second vice president under John Adams. So this guy has a very illustrious resume as well. He is a founding father along with George Washington, who we just covered. He was the primary author of that wonderful document, the Declaration of Independence. He was the nation's first U.S. Secretary of State under George Washington. So while George Washington was the president, he was a mover and shaker of things. And he was the nation's second vice president under John Adams. John Adams being the second president of the United States. So Thomas Jefferson has an impeccable resume as well. But when you look just beneath the surface, Thomas Jefferson, too, was a slave owner. Now, you see how they say that he was one of the primary authors. Well, not one of, he was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence from July the 4th, 1776. Now, I have to admit, in theory, this is an excellent document, wonderful document, especially with some of the things that it lays out. See, the thing about me, I don't hate the Declaration of Independence, and I'm not gonna talk badly about the Declaration of Independence. I just want to highlight what's in the Declaration of Independence, and I want to juxtapose it against the actions, the living actions of the individual who was its primary author, and show and highlight the contradictions. Because although this individual has a very extensive resume, and although he was the primary author of a very important document in U.S. history, he was a slave owner. And so we really have to look into the psychology of Thomas Jefferson and see if he was actually as good a guy as the history books make him out to be. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, they have what they call a preamble. It's a particular section out of the Declaration of Independence that I would like to highlight. Now, I'm going to read this preamble for you guys. And while I'm reading this, I want you to remember that the author of this actually came from Thomas Jefferson. The author of this was a slave owner before, during, and after writing these words. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security." Now, what is the Declaration of Independence about? The Declaration of Independence is basically about the United States of America, or the colonies, the 13 colonies, declaring their independence from the British colonial powers. And the whole idea is that the colonists and the people that ran the colonists had felt the governing body overseas in Great Britain, the King of Britain and the Parliament, did not have their best interests at heart. And they were putting on them taxes, rules, and laws that were unjust. And they were basically saying that whenever a group of people who are governed by a government who are full of despots and who are hindering the people that are governed, hindering them from enjoying their life who are stopping them from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those people have every right to replace that cruel, evil, wicked government that does not care about them and institute a government that has their best interests at heart. And whenever this happens in history, the individuals who want to be free, they must declare their independence from the governing body that once governed them or that once controlled them. So the 13 colonies being ran by the King George III of Britain, they had to declare their independence from the British government, and they had to declare why. And so you see the things that led them to declare their own independence from Great Britain, they were actually guilty of doing to the African American population. They were actually enslaving people. They actually prevented them from enjoying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were the exact government that they were saying that they wanted to get from up under the yoke of. It's a classic paradox or a conundrum. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. In one breath, you say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And at the same moment when you pen these words, you own slaves and you have a plantation. If all men are created equal, why, Thomas Jefferson, are you a slave owner? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. Now, the individual that you see on your screen, this is King George III of Britain. For any of you that do not know, here's a little history. When they talk about the American Revolution, this is the guy that they was directly revolting against. It was King George III. Notice, he was the King of Britain from June 4th, 1738 to January 29th, 1820. Now, right smack dab in the middle of his rule, you have the magic date of July 4th, 1776, which is what? Independence Day. So, the Declaration of Independence is declaring independence, yes, from the colonial rule of Britain, but the colonial rule of Britain, that parliament, those people, they had a king, they had a monarchy. Who was the monarchy during the Revolutionary War? You're looking at him, King George III of Britain. So they were declaring their independence from this guy right here, if you never knew that. Now, in Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, he included a passage accusing King George III of foisting slavery upon the colonists through the slave trade. Now, several drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written before the final version we have and know of today. Now, in one of those rough drafts, Jefferson actually wrote some pretty harsh words to this dude right here, or about this guy right here, King George III. Because remember, when a nation wants to disassociate themselves or become independent from the governing power that governs them, how the American government, how the colonists describe it, they must declare why they want to be Indians. The Declaration of Independence. You're declaring your independence and you're declaring why. You're pointing out, you're pointing out what's wrong with the government that governs you. And this is why you are in open rebellion against said government and why you need to create a new government, a government that will have your best interests at heart. So in following that line of thought, Thomas Jefferson had to declare why they wanted to become independent from King George III of Britain. And it's ironic because one of the things he speaks badly about this guy is that King George III supported slavery. And I'm going to get into this. But again, now, when I'm reading this, I want you to think about something. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. His father owned slaves. He came from a slaveholding family. So you're about to hear a slave owner chastising another slave owner in one of the rough drafts of the Declaration of Independence. He says, and speaking of King George III, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This political warfare of opprobrium of infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this excruciable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished die. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms amongst us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, in murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Now, if you don't understand what he's saying, you can pause that, read over it, and try to digest it, but I'm going to give you a quick summary. What he's basically saying, listen, he says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. He's talking about how King George III violated the rights of the Africans by going to Africa and capturing people, enslaving them, and taking them to another hemisphere, sending them to the Americas to be enslaved in the Americas. He goes on to say, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. A lot of Africans died on the slave ships going from Africa to America. And some of them committed suicide, jumping off the boats and drowning in the waters. Right? This is what he is referring to. And then he says, he goes on to say that this is this Christian king's war against infidel powers, how King George tried to validate and substantiate the slave trade, and even various popes tried to validate and substantiate the slave trade. They all said that since these Africans and these natives were not Christian people, then they were able to be enslaved. That's what he means by infidel powers. Since these nations in Africa aren't Christians, they could be enslaved, right? And so when he goes on to say that he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms amongst us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, in murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them. When the Revolutionary War was going on, and when the American people and Great Britain had beef, the British government was offering freedom to any of the slaves in America that joined their ranks, that fought against the Americans and tried to make it to the British side. So he's saying that King George, he took the liberty of the Africans by enslaving them and sending them to America. And now he was trying to excite those very people, those Africans, to rise arms amongst the colonists and to purchase their liberty, for the Africans to purchase their liberty back, the liberty that King George III deprived them of in the first place by capturing them and by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, saying the Africans can purchase the freedom that King George denied them by murdering the colonists being the people who the slaves were forced upon by King George III. So if you read through this rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, this was one of the charges levied against King George, especially when the Great Britain was trying to say that, oh, if you fight against the colonists on behalf of Britain, hey, you can be free. We'll give you your freedom. And so he's trying to charge him with horrible crimes for that. But again, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. So on the surface, you will read this, and if you don't know his history, you will be like, "Wow, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. Man, he really tore King George III a new one in defense of the enslaved." You may want to give him a pat on the back, but don't give him a pat on the back just yet. Thomas Jefferson owned over 600 slaves. I'm going to say it again. Thomas Jefferson, the man who just said that about King George III, he himself owned over 600 slaves. The primary author of this famous document, the Declaration of Independence, was none other than Thomas Jefferson. Although these words, that preamble that I read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Although these words have been quoted and repeated countless times throughout history to underscore American values and bolster American democracy, it is a profound paradox that the man behind these words had such a complicated relationship with the concept of equality he wrote about in the Declaration of Independence. Despite working tirelessly to establish a new nation founded upon principles of freedom and egalitarianism, Jefferson owned over 600 people in 600 enslaved people during his lifetime, the most of any U.S. president. The enslaved individuals working for Thomas Jefferson accompanied him during each phase of his career, including his time at the White House. Just like George Washington, while in the White House, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, and those slaves were in the White House with him. Now, the man who wrote those such quote-unquote beautiful words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You've heard that over and over and over again. And then the man who penned those words, he himself owned over 600 enslaved people during his lifetime, the most of any U.S. president. So he endorsed in the institution of slavery more than any other United States president. So on some level, we have to ask ourselves how much of the Declaration of Independence is lip service and how much of it was actually from the heart. Did he really feel that all men are created equal? How could he feel in his heart that all men are created equal and at the same time own more slaves than any other U.S. president? Hundreds. I mean, if he really felt in his heart that all men were created equal in his own life, wouldn't he have freed these enslaved people? Wouldn't he have freed these? Think about that. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Nigga, get my pen. That all men are created. I said, nigga, get my pen. All men are created equal. Nigga, come on, man. Come on, man. It's double. It's you forked tongue. You are forked tongue. You got to look at the actions. You got to look at the actions. While we may highlight some of the good that an individual did in their life, I mean, this has to be highlighted as well, because we really have to look at the mind state of these so-called founding fathers. Now, enslaved in the household of President Thomas Jefferson, we don't know the names of all of the 600 people he enslaved over his lifetime, but we do know the names of some. So may their names live on forever and may their memory never die. Let's read some of the names that we do know. You have Ursula Granger Hughes, Edith Edie Hearn Foster, Frances Fanny Gillett Hearn, Gillette Hearn, James Fawcett, a child, Maria Fawcett, a child, probably children of Edith. You have Baby Fawcett, Baby Hearn, Baby Asnet. You have John Freeman, John Jack Shorter, Alethea Browning Tanner. These individuals were enslaved to the man who penned the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Crazy. Now, you may want to ask yourself, we know where George Washington plantation was at, and we know what it was called, Mount Vernon. But what about Thomas Jefferson? What about his plantation? Monticello. Monticello. If you ever hear about the property of Thomas Jefferson, known as Monticello, Monticello was a slave plantation. It is where Thomas Jefferson had his slaves. And like George Washington, he inherited slaves from his father as well. He comes from a slave owning background. Now, I know a lot of people have debit card these days. Not many people carry around cash, but everybody knows what a nickel looks like. If you look on the back of your nickel, right, you're going to see a structure on the back of that nickel. That structure is the Monticello plantation. That structure is the Monticello plantation. That is where Thomas Jefferson lived, and that is where Thomas Jefferson had his enslaved individuals. Okay. And it is said that he had houses on the property built and rebuilt several times. It is said that he was a good architect, and he learned how to do architecture from reading books, and he actually designed this property. And so in honor of him being a president, in honor of him designing this building, they put this building on the back of the nickel. But just be aware that that structure on the back of the nickel, the 5 cents, is a representation of not only the living quarters of the third president of the United States, but is also a representation of a slave plantation, Monticello plantation. Look, in the 1750s, Peter Jefferson established a tobacco farm on the slopes of a small mountain across the Riviera River from Shadwell. Thomas Jefferson called this mountain Monticello and made it the center of his world. Over the next 40 years, free and enslaved workers built and rebuilt his now famous house, and enslaved laborers produced his cash crops of tobacco and wheat until his death in 1826. So on this slave plantation, Thomas Jefferson used his enslaved labor force, which over the years before his death encompassed around 600 people. He had them to produce tobacco and wheat. And these were his quote unquote cash crops. Now, one of the main reasons why Thomas Jefferson, although he pretended to be a lover of freedom and rights and independence, one of the main reasons why he refused to give up his slaves and why he got more and more slaves over the years, it was all about money. All about money. His wealth was intimately tied into the institution of slavery. And so he did not want to get rid of his slave. Although he tried to make it seem like he wanted the institution of slavery to end, he didn't want the institution of slavery to end and hurt his pockets, which is why no one wanted the institution of slavery to end. Everyone that wanted to keep that institution going, monetary gain. Free labor. They love the free labor. He didn't want to pay regular wages. He wanted to live like a king, and live like a king he did. So we're not going to pretend like it was anything else. Now, this is a picture of enslaved individuals gathering wheat on the Monticello plantation. Now check this out. At any one time, about 130 enslaved men, women, and children lived and worked at Monticello. Jefferson initially acquired most of his slaves through inheritance from his father and father-in-law. He comes from a slave-owning background. The Monticello plantation comprised 5,000 acres divided into 4 farms: the Monticello Home Farm, Shadwell, Tufton, and Lego. Farm laborers lived near the fields where they worked. House servants and artisans lived in log dwellings on the mountaintop along Mulberry Road, or in rooms under the south terrace of the main house. Now, check this out. Check this out. We're going to talk about some of the slave quarters in Monticello. Now, the description of the slave quarters from plantation to plantation, they were all generally the same. From state to state, they were all generally the same. But what you have on the left is a depiction of what the average slave quarters on Thomas Jefferson's plantation looked like. And again, you have the fireplace, you have, a few bottles, a few bowls and stuff to eat out of. You have a basket for laundry right there. You have a bed. You have a couple of windows, a stool, etc., etc. Now, a family would live in something like this. And a lot of times the children would just have to sleep on the floor. Now, what you're looking at on the right is actual archaeological excavations that they're doing on the Monticello plantation. A lot of these sites, they are of immense historical value. I love history. I'm not a proponent of destroying history in any shape, form, or fashion. Even the history that is negative towards my own people. I think history should be left as it is, what it is. I think the villains of history should be written down as the villains of history, so individuals will know. We don't need to hide their despotism. We need to put it out on Front Street. The heroes of history, we need to put their heroic acts out there on Front Street. History is history. You can't go back and change it, but you can learn from it. And so they're doing a lot of archaeological digs on several of these plantations, one of which being the Monticello plantation. Now, this is going to segue into something real interesting. I'm going to show you guys what they're saying about this particular dig. And I want you to look right here. You can see these these five individuals surveying the area where they're digging up. And you can see that there was some type of building, some type of home, some type of structure, several structures built right here that is no longer there, but they have the layout carved out. And so they're digging around in here for archaeological artifacts so they can piece together bits and pieces of information to get a fuller scope of history. Now look at this top picture. It says subfloor pits dug into the floors of slave dwellings like the Negro Quarter protected the valuables of enslaved families. Archaeologists use this evidence to determine how many families may have occupied the site. So what this is the slave quarters that they're currently digging around in and doing their archaeological dig. And what they found out that a lot of these slave quarters, they didn't have floors. They were dirt floors, okay? And so what they would do is they would dig down into the floor, and any type of valuables that the enslaved people did happen to come across, they would bury it in the floor. And I know this is a reality because when I read through the slave narratives that I share with you guys quite often, there is a story about someone finding money buried underneath the floor. So look, check this out. One of the archaeological digs that they're doing is they're digging in these subfloor pits, and they're finding some of these valuables that were left behind by some of the slaves. So look at this, what they're looking at on the Monticello plantation. They say, who lived here? In the 1770s, Jefferson intended several families for the Negro Quarter, including valet Jupiter, his valet named Jupiter, his wife Suck, and their children, and foreman George Granger Sr., his wife Ursula, and their sons. The three log dwellings that replaced the Negro Quarter in the 1790s likely housed Hemmings family members, including chambermaid and seamstress Sally and her children, parlor maid Critta and her son James, and house joiner John and his wife Priscilla. Since Critta Hemmings was oftenest wanted about the house she may have lived in building R. But I want to show you guys something. You see where it says seamstress Sally? Now that is an interesting individual in the narrative of Thomas Jefferson and his slave ownings and the slaves that he owned. So who was Sally? Sally was a woman named Sally Hemings. And going all the way back to the actual time that Thomas Jefferson lived, everyone claimed that he was having a relationship with Sally Hemings. So this guy, Thomas Jefferson, is a more interesting character than we first thought. We see him being a statesman. We see him being a president. We see him being an author of the Declaration of Independence. We see him writing scathing paragraphs in the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence to King George III. We see him as a descendant from a slave owner. We see him owning more slaves in U.S. history than any other president. And now we see that he was also accused of having a sexual relationship with one of the individuals that was enslaved to him. One of the individuals that was enslaved to him, he was accused of having a sexual relationship with. And it was claimed, the claim has been proven, but it was claimed that Thomas Jefferson had 6 children by one of his slaves named Sally Hemings. And this Sally Hemings, her dwelling place is one of the places that is being excavated on the Monticello plantation right now. They're actually excavating where she lived. And Thomas Jefferson, it is said, had 6 children by this woman. He kept going back, kept going back, kept going back. They had a love affair that lasted for years. Now look, check this out. On the left is this a newspaper article. Now, the first paragraph of an article in the Recorder, or Ladies and Gentlemen's Miscellany, a Federalist newspaper in Richmond, accuses Thomas Jefferson of keeping one of his slaves, a woman named Sally, as his concubine and fathering a child with her. The President Again was published on September 1st, 1802, while Jefferson served as president. Its author, James Thompson Callender, had once been Jefferson's own hatchet man, but with these accusations, he turned on his former patron. So now we have this guy, Thomas Jefferson, with a concubine that he had 6 children by. So what we're going to do, let's take a look at the article written in September 1st, 1802, accusing President Thomas Jefferson of having a sexual relationship with one of the people he had enslaved. The article said, "It is well known that the man whom it delighted the people to honor keeps, and for many years past has kept, as his concubine one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally." Stop right there. So he's sleeping with this woman over and over and over again. And while he's doing this, she is still his slave. This lover of freedom, this lover of independence, this lover of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He didn't even free her. He kept her as a slave while she was his concubine. Her name is Sally. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear a striking, although sable resemblance to those of the president himself. The boy is 10 or 12 years of age. His mother went to France in the same vessel with Mr. Jefferson and his 2 daughters. The delicacy of this arrangement must strike every person of common sensibility. What a sublime pattern for any American ambassador to place before the eyes of 2 young ladies. So at some point, while Thomas Jefferson was president, he went to France. And when he went to France, he not only took his 2 daughters, but he took this woman, Sally, with him. Just couldn't be away from her. And this is just a picture likeness of what Sally possibly looked like, along with Thomas Jefferson. Look, years after his wife's death, Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Sally Hemings' children. 4 survived to adulthood and are mentioned in Jefferson's plantation records: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Easton Hemings. Sally Hemings worked for 2.5 years in Paris as a domestic servant and maid in Jefferson's household. In Paris, she went to France with him. While in Paris, where enslaved people could petition for their freedom, she negotiated with Jefferson to return to enslavement at Monticello in exchange for extraordinary privileges for herself and freedom for her unborn children. Decades later, Jefferson freed all of Sally Hemings' children. Beverly and Harriet left Monticello in the early 1820s. Madison and Easton were freed in his will and left Monticello in 1826. Jefferson did not grant freedom to any other enslaved family unit. So the only people that he freed from slavery were the children of the woman that he was sleeping with. And so common sense will tell us that those children were his own children. That's why he gave them their freedom. He gave them their freedom because they were his children in exchange for her coming back to America with him. Right? Because they had children. Those children are back in America, still enslaved. He take her to Paris with him. Now in Paris, she can try to negotiate for freedom. She can try to get free while they're in Paris. So to make sure that she didn't try to leave him and that she would come back to America with him, he said, okay, look, check this out. If you come back to America with me, I'll negotiate with you for your freedom and with the freedom of your children. And so Sally Hemings, wishing for her children to be free, came back with Thomas Jefferson and honored her half of the agreement. And he honored his, and he freed her children, which were his children. But take note that Jefferson did not grant freedom to any other enslaved family unit. So now we see he understands and he has the power to grant freedom to the people that he has enslaved, but he just chose not to. So even with the guise or the mask of being an abolitionist and feeling that slavery is so wrong and talking so bad about King George III, he had all the power in the world to free hundreds of enslaved individuals. And the only ones he chose to free were the children that he had by an enslaved woman. Now check this out. Before we wrap this up, I want to show you guys something. Because in modern times we have something that's called DNA, right? We got something that's called DNA research. So it was long thought to just be like a rumor, right? A rumor about Thomas Jefferson having an affair with Sally Hemings and them having children together. And everybody basically believed it, but those, when it wasn't no absolute proof, you still had people who could deny it. But look, check this out. Monticello affirms Thomas Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings. What is Monticello? Monticello Plantation? That was his property. So we're going right to the source. The people that have every reason to lie about this to protect this image have affirmed that Thomas Jefferson fathered the children with Hemings. The issue of Jefferson's paternity has been the subject of controversy for at least 2 centuries, ranging from contemporary newspaper articles in 1802, the one that I showed you, to scholarly debate well into the 1990s. It is now the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's view that the issue is a settled historical matter. A considerable body of evidence stretching from 1802 to 1873 and beyond describes Thomas Jefferson as the father of Sally Hemings' children. It was corroborated by the findings of the Y chromosome haplotype DNA study conducted by Dr. Eugene Foster and published in the Scientific Journal of Nature in November 1998. The DNA study did prove paternity of a Jefferson family member and corroborated the ample documentary and oral history evidence. Other evidence supports Thomas Jefferson's paternity as well, including his presence at Monticello during Sally Hemings' likely windows of conception. the names of Hemings' surviving children, and the fact that all of her children were granted freedom. They were either allowed to leave the plantation or legally emancipated in Jefferson's will, a unique occurrence among Montefello's enslaved families. The summary of the most important evidence proving Jefferson's paternity is listed below. So they say the DNA evidence proves that Thomas Jefferson was the father. The fact that he was present when she gave birth to all of the children proved that he was the father. And the fact that he granted freedom to all of her children proved that he was the father. And then they go through and they list some of the evidence, and you just see when you stack up all of the evidence, it's obvious that Thomas Jefferson had children with this enslaved woman. Madison Hemings provided an account of his mother's life that was published in an Ohio newspaper in 1873. The basic outline of Madison Hemings' account included his mother's treaty with Jefferson, and the freedom granted to him and his siblings was well known to his community. So one of the pieces of evidence is the fact that all of her children were freed, and he did this for nobody else. He did this for nobody else but the children of Sally Hemings, because they were his children. The DNA study is another piece of evidence. The DNA study that directly tied her children to a male Jefferson is evidence that Thomas Jefferson was the father. Madison Hemings was described by a U.S. census taker as the son of Thomas Jefferson in 1870. So when they was taking a census in 1870, they named one of her children. A U.S. census taker named one of Sally Hemings' children as the son of Thomas Jefferson. Look, Israel Gillette Jefferson, formerly enslaved at Monticello, corroborated Madison Hemings' claim in the same newspaper, referring to Sally Hemings as Thomas Jefferson's concubine. So they had the eyewitness testimony of someone else who was formerly enslaved at Monticello, who knew that Thomas Jefferson was having an affair with Sally Hemings. Easton Hemings changed his racial identity to white and his surname to Jefferson. One of the children changed his racial identity to white and his surname to Jefferson because he knew that Thomas Jefferson was his father. The freedom given to her children, and just the list goes on and on. Look, Jefferson's records of his travels and the birthdays of Sally Hemings' children reveal that he was present at Monticello during the estimated dates of conception for all 6 of Hemings' documented offspring. So every time frame of conception for the children, when she would have gotten pregnant, records reveal that Thomas Jefferson was there for every single one. They say statistical modeling shows the likelihood of this coincidence for any other male, if we assume that Thomas Jefferson is not the father, as 1% or 1 chance in 100. Strong evidence of Thomas Jefferson's paternity. Remember, the DNA evidence said that a Jefferson was indeed the father. Okay, now they're saying that Thomas Jefferson was there every single time she conceived. And the statistical probability that any other male Jefferson was there every single time she conceived was 1% or 1 chance in 100. But it's already confirmed that he was there. They also say that oral tradition connects them both. The fact that Jefferson freed all of her remaining slaves. And they say even the name of Sally Hemings' 4 surviving children, William Beverly Hemings, Harriet Hemings, James Madison Hemings, and Thomas Eston Hemings, suggests family ties to Thomas Jefferson. They were even named after individuals in the Thomas Jefferson family line. So without a doubt, I mean, you could play games if you want, but without a doubt, Thomas Jefferson was having an affair with one of his enslaved individuals, one of his enslaved women, and he had 6 children by her, and those children were the only people that he ever freed. So, Presidential Slave Owners, The Dark History of the United States, Part 1, where we're just dealing with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. George Washington oversaw 317 slaves, and he owned 123 personally. Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, he owned over his lifetime, he owned over 600. Both men pretended to be anti-slavery and they pretended to be abolitionists, but when you really dig off into the history, each of them had an opportunity to free the slaves that they owned, and both of them chose not to do so. George Washington, when living in Pennsylvania, and they passed the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. It was stipulated in the law that if any enslaved person resided in the state of Pennsylvania for 6 consecutive months, they could become free. George Washington, if he really wanted to see slaves freed, he could have allowed his slaves to enjoy that freedom. But instead, what did he do? When the 6-month timetable was running out, he transported them back to Mount Vernon in Virginia. And then he brought them back to Pennsylvania, effectively restarting the 6 consecutive months. So he had another 6 months to own them. And when the 6 months began to run out again, he shipped them back to Mount Virginia, and he played this game. And he told the people closest to him to never tell a soul that this is what he was doing. Thomas Jefferson, obviously, if he could free his children by Sally Hemings, he could have freed any of the enslaved people under him. So while they pretended that they wanted to see slavery ended, it's obvious neither one of them wanted to see it in their lifetime, and neither one of them wanted to be the person to free slaves. They didn't even want to free the ones that they owned, and both of them came from slave owning backgrounds. In part 2, we're going to be taking a look at James Madison and John Monroe, the 4th and 5th presidents of the United States. So as always, I hope you guys heard something that you never heard before. I hope you appreciate me sharing this history with you guys, and I hope it sheds some light on the real historical record, the dark historical record of the United States. So thanks for watching. Again, make sure you hit that like button. If you haven't, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And this your brother, Matthew Daniels, aka the Real Bookworm. I'm not just a bookworm world. I am the real bookworm. I'm doing the book game like it ain't never been done before. And I'm doing the book game like it'll probably never be done again. Let's make intelligence great again, family. I'm out.